Hi, welcome back. My name is Tobias Tabasco, and in the last part we kind of finished setting up our landscape material, and now it's time to combine the landscape with some actual 3D assets, and we're gonna do that by creating some virtual textures. Okay, now that we have our landscape set up, let's put some actual 3D assets in there. We already have our one rock here, and I think we can scatter this around on the scene and just see how that looks. Of course, it will not look super sophisticated, but it's going to be nice. And we want to go into the foliage mode for that. I think it's always great if you can save a bit of time, and by using this foliage mode, you can save a lot of time. So just take your static mesh once you're in the foliage mode and drag it onto this foliage setting here. And then we can paint this static mesh as a foliage. So if you start doing that, it will of course compile a few shaders because it's being used with foliage. And you can see that we have painted a lot of rocks. Of course, we can adjust these settings slightly so that it will look a lot better. So let's just up the radius of this like 100, and we want the density maybe 2. So just here and there we are scattering some rocks. A few more, 4 maybe. That kind of looks good to me. And then we want to alter the scaling. One thing that you might notice when we paint these rocks is that they are always kind of above the ground level. That's not optimal, and we can just fix that by also adjusting the settings here slightly. So in the Z offset, we can just change this to something slightly less, like -20 or -40 or something, and then you will see that the rocks nicely stick into our ground geometry. There we go. That looks great. Feel free to adjust these settings even further. You can change the mobility, for example. And one thing that we might want to do is check the affect distance field lighting, because we are using distance fields. So I think we want to make this affect the distance fields, and we're going to set this to block all. As it's a rock, we want the collision to block everything. So one thing that you might notice when scattering all these rocks around is that they don't really blend with the landscape. And we can of course fix that by using the virtual textures. So let's create a material for this rock that utilizes the virtual textures. There's a bit of a setup needed to make these virtual textures blending, to make this virtual texture blending materials. And first of all, let's get out of this foliage mode. We have to create a virtual texture volume, runtime virtual texture volume. Assuming you have the virtual textures enabled in your project, that's under edit plugin, under project settings, you can enable the virtual textures, which we did at the beginning. And then just drag this virtual texture volume in. And I'm gonna call this RVT, real-time virtual texture volume, and then height, because we're going to need 2 of them. Sorry, let me quickly shuffle these around, move that to atmosphere, onto atmosphere, and this one we're going to create a new folder called virtual textures. I really like having some nice sorting in my scene. I don't like chaos. Okay, so let's duplicate this virtual texture volume that we created, and let's just call that one color, because one is blending the color and the other one is capturing the height information, basically. And then we have to set the bounds of these volumes, and we can do that by just selecting our landscape here in this bounds align actor dropbox, and for the other one as well. You can actually also hit this snap to landscape button. That will probably snap it to our landscape. It should in theory update these once we put a virtual texture in here. I think we can hit this bounce button, not sure, maybe it will automatically do it. Anyway, so the next step is to create some actual virtual textures, and we can do that if we go into our landscape folder again. Materials and textures, there is the runtime virtual textures here, runtime virtual texture, and I'm going to call that height, as this is the first one, and we want to put that in the height channel here. And now we get the set bounds, and we can just hit that button to update the bounds. You can see that the bounds now nicely encompass the entire landscape. That's just so that the render target knows where to render, while the virtual texture knows where to render. And let's duplicate this one and call it color. And we're going to set that in here to the color one, also hit the set bounds, and now we have both of them set correctly to the bounds. There's a few things we need to adjust in these runtime virtual textures. So if we open height, we want to actually change this virtual texture content to world height, of course, because we are capturing height. And in the other one, we could leave it on this base color. I'm going to change it to the YCOCG, as it has a bit more detailed information, and I just like that. I am not sure if that is if it actually makes that much of a difference, but why not take the more detailed one if we can? It's of course costing more memory, but we are going next gen here, so I think that is fine. Okay, now we have our virtual texture set up. We have our virtual texture volumes set up, and now it comes to the material setup. So the first thing that we want to do is capture the material of the landscape in our virtual texture. And we do that by opening up the landscape material, and then we add some stuff here at the end to capture the virtual textures. And to do that, you just add the runtime virtual texture node, runtime virtual texture output node. And in here, we will plug in all the attributes that we need. So we need to get the attributes that we have here and just break material attributes to get all of them. And let's just get the ones over that we want. Base color. I mean, metallic, there is no slot bar, so we don't have any metallic in our scene, in our environment, so that is no problem at all. Otherwise, you would need to, you can hack it in, for example, by putting the metallic into a mask or something like that, or into the opacity, and do it that way. It's a bit of a hack, but it should work. And then we don't have anisotropy, we have nothing of that. And the last one that we want is the normal here. And the last thing that we want is this world height parameter, which is going to go into our height virtual texture so that we can blend properly. And if you just hit position, you get the world position. And we are going to use the world position, but not the all of the world position. With Shift C, again, we are getting this component mask parameter, and we want just the blue channel, as in the blue channel is the height. In this vector, the blue channel is the height from this world position. And this should now, if we assign the virtual textures to our landscape, already write all of the material information that we're getting from here into our virtual textures. So with our landscape selected, there is a section for virtual textures down here. And we can just draw in virtual textures, the two textures that we created. So our height and our color information. And we can already see that something is actually going on there, right? It's already writing some height information and some color information into these two textures. And now we want to read these two virtual textures in our rock material. I think our rocks by default have a normal material applied here. The displacement material, as we ticked this box earlier in the Megascans details. And so we want to alter this one to actually read the data from our virtual textures. And I have already created a material function for that, virtual texture blending, as I just didn't want to do that in the tutorial, which I'm going to walk you through that right now, just step by step. If you never created a material function, it's actually quite easy. You can just right click here, materials, material function, and then you will get a material function which you can use in all of your materials. I've created a folder here and just put that in there. And then, yeah, in the material function has an input and an output. And well, if you don't have this input here, just create one by typing input and then change the input type to material attributes. And we are going to pipe material attributes in, and then we're going to blend that with the virtual textures. And the basic blending, I'm doing a blending for the normal map a bit separately, because I want to blend onto the landscape normals in a certain way. But the default blending is kind of this stuff down here, which is our mask that we use to blend. So the mask is usually is piped here in this blend material attributes, right? In the alpha is a black and white mask. And this mask is from the world height of our runtime virtual texture, from the height virtual texture. So just hit runtime virtual texture and then sample, which is that's the one that we want. And we in the sample we have to assign our height virtual texture and change this to height as well. And then we can drag out the world height, and we're gonna use the we're gonna subtract this world height from the world position of our actor. So this would be the position of our rock actor, and we just subtract this world height to get a proper mask that is in the local space basically of this actor. And then we can just add an offset to it, and we create a fall off. This version here, subtracting, dividing, and saturating again, is the default to add a offset and then a fall off. So by subtracting something, you just add an offset in height, for example, in this case. And by dividing, you can soften this transition of the edge. And then you need to saturate it again to bring it into a normal range of 0 to 1. So saturate is basically the same as a clamp node. So it's exactly a clamp node between 0 and 1. But if you hover over it, it says clamps the value between 0 and 1. Saturate is free on most modern graphics hardware. So that's why I always use a saturate node and not a clamp node. It does exactly the same. And on top of this height blending, basically the height fall off, I've also added a small little detail here to make the vertex normal of our mesh affect this blend. So I'm just using the vertex normal blue channel, and I'm inverting this so that I am, I'm just inverting it, and then I changed the blend power slightly, and I'm adding this on top of the other stuff to get a proper mask for our blending. And yeah, just pipe that into the blend material attributes. Our function input, this is the material attributes from our rock. So our rock material attributes are kind of going into this one here. Just pipe that into our B channel. And now we come to the other part, which is the color information that we captured in our runtime virtual texture. The color information we can just basically, we could pipe that in directly, but I've changed this so I can alter the color slightly, because sometimes you get a bit of a disparity in these runtime virtual textures. Like they're sometimes a bit lighter, a bit darker, and I kind of compensate for that here in the material directly. So I've added these two parameters, a multiplier for the color just to make it brighter or darker, and also a desaturation node, which you can use to saturate or desaturate the color slightly more. And then I'm just adding a set material attribute node again, setting all of these parameters together and piping it in the blend material attribute A channel. That would already suffice. However, for the normal blending, I wanted something a bit more special. So I took the normal of our runtime virtual texture, and I'm combining it with the one from our rock mesh. Because I don't want the runtime virtual texture normal only, I really want to combine these two together in a certain way, and that is why I added this. So from our rock material, I'm getting the material attribute normal, blend and angle corrected normals. And this runtime virtual texture, by the way, the normal here is in world space. So it captures it in world space. So I am transforming it here back into the tangent space as we're using the tangent space in our rock material. And then these two normals combined, I'm just gonna blend them here with this normal fall off. I just added a separate one, blend normal fall off, to blend these together, and then I'm piping it into the normal, which we are then gonna blend over the mesh. And yeah, this is our material function. Don't forget to hit the expose to library, just click here in the nowhere, and then you get these details. Expose to library, and then I'm just gonna give it a few names like virtual textures, for example, or next gen tutorial, and you can add a description. And of course, sorry, here I forgot in this runtime virtual texture sample, here we need to assign the proper virtual texture content and also our color map. Hit apply, save that. And then we want to add this to our master displacement material here. And I'm gonna do this before the displacement, I think. I'm not quite sure which one works better. I think it's better to do this before the displacement, otherwise we will get artifacts. Just pipe that in between, hit apply, and in theory it should already be doing something. Minimize that. And yeah, it already works, actually. That was everything. If I click on my mesh, maybe we can take a single mesh to see this better, not our foliage. So here's our mesh, and as soon as I start dragging it into a certain range of our landscape material, you can see that the blending on these edges here is happening. And it's not perfect, like you will see some artifacts, there is a small line still visible here, but it's really not bad, like especially if you go a bit lower here, it's really not too bad. Maybe the detail is not as high as our runtime virtual texture, maybe because it's so large from our terrain, cannot really keep up with the details here. We might be able to change it by just increasing the size of the runtime virtual texture. So here it says size of the virtual texture, and we can maybe just up that to something a bit higher. Maybe 10. This will of course make it more expensive. But now you can see that the blending is already working a lot better. I think that it captures more of this moss detail now in the texture itself. And yeah, I mean, from a distance, you probably wouldn't even notice the difference between these two. If we want to adjust the values slightly, I've added all of these parameters in our... oh, I forgot these two basically. Actually, here in our virtual texture blending material function, I've added a group here for this called virtual texture blending. And I forgot to put these two into the group. Here you can see my default values, by the way, desaturation. I've already desaturated it slightly because I feel like the with no desaturation, I feel like this kind of looks a bit too saturated. And with the desaturation, okay, it's a minor detail. By the way, with the desaturation, if you go into a positive, it desaturates, and if you go into a negative, it does saturate. It adds saturation. So I kind of added a bit of saturation to make this blend look a bit more natural. And also, if I would set the tint to 1, you can see that it's kind of a tiny bit lighter than the surrounding, than the actual surface there. That's why I darkened it slightly so that we have a bit of a better blend. You can of course play around with these, you know, maybe it's I don't know, It's a bit difficult to find the right values there. It's not entirely perfect, but pretty good. And to change this fall off that we added, we can play around with these 3 parameters here, like the blend fall off. You can see that this kind of creeps higher and higher, but the mask is not really nice. Like, I think you want a soft blend but not too wide. And of course you could add a proper mask. We could add a bit of noise in there and just change the way this blend works. And then, yeah, with this blend power material, for example, you can change the power of this blend, but I don't like to go super crazy there. I think the values that I had as default are quite okay. And the offset shifts the entire edge of this blend up and down, basically. Maybe we just need a slight blend here at the bottom. So for me, this value here is actually a bit better. Yeah, and there we go. Now we have virtual texture blending. Our foliage methods nicely blend within the ground. The same one works actually here on the rocks, at least it should. If we, so not only on the moss. So if we go onto the rocks, it should also blend here with the rocks. Become one with the rock. Here maybe the offset is not high enough. Feels like the offset here should be a bit higher on these rocks. It's kind of finding a sweet spot, right? Like, because we cannot really change this per material, this offset. So it's kind of finding the right spot there. Maybe my default value wasn't too bad. And yeah, this basically looks like one asset now, but it's not. I mean, here you get a bit of stretching where these meshes are, where the normal is too vertical, but that's fine. Sometimes it's not even visible, the blend. On this, I think the problem is that the displacement of the surface alters the height of our mesh. So maybe we can, because here is a lot of displacement going on, so the blend is working somewhere in here, right inside of the mesh. It kind of blends to this rock texture because it doesn't know that there is displacement going on. I can show you in a second. Maybe we can fix that. So in our landscape material, we have a lot of displacement going on, but we are only feeding the absolute world position in there. What we would actually need to do is add the displacement on top of it. So if we take our world position, we add this displacement on top, and then we take the blue channel. Of course, this displacement is also negative. So I am clamping it here, but just in the minimum value. I don't want this to go down when multiplying here with this value. That's why I am clamping the value at 0. And then I've added this multiply to kind of offset this entire absolute world position by the displacement. And I can alter this value to change how it behaves. You will see in a second. So I'm just applying this to my landscape material. Let's see, I'm just guessing here, it's all guesswork. Welcome to Unreal Tutorials, where we're just guessing. And then in my material instance, we can change this displacement offset parameter in the landscape material. And you will see in a second what this does. So if I set this to 1, you can clearly see that here on the intersection, where we are displacing a lot of geometry, the mesh edge is really not working. And if we add more to this displacement parameter, we can see that it kind of reads more of this displacement of the rocks into all of this and applies it. So I think parameter 5, 4, 5 works quite nicely. And then we have the blend also on our displaced surfaces. Looks a bit crazy from time to time, but I think in general, this is amazing. Like I think you wouldn't on first glance notice that there is a separate mesh intersecting here with this original geometry mesh, or with this landscape in general. And we can also try this with a point light. The edge will become a bit more obvious here, but in theory, because the normals are blending, like here, for example, I think you can't really see it that much, that these two meshes are not are separate, right? Like it's really hard to see where this mesh is intersecting. Yeah, and this works for our foliage actors, of course, as well. I think on the moss we get a bit of stretching. We get more stretching than on these rocky surfaces. It works better because it has a lot more noise in it. But in general, I think this is a really nice result for a cheap way of doing it, and a fast way as well of doing it. Okay, so yeah, that concludes our mesh blending as well. We can turn on the ray tracing one more time, just to see the difference. Let me quickly close all of this. In the ray tracing, you will get a lot darker shadows, of course, here from this directional light, but we're not getting any artifacts, so the ray tracing works perfectly fine with this mesh blending also. Here, by the way, is a custom mesh in there, right? It's really hard to see. I think the blending is so good. Yeah, so that's really nice that this works as well. You might notice that we have a bit of flickering going on here. When we go back with the camera, you can see it on this mesh in particular. And that's the LODs kicking in. I think if we disable the ray tracing, it might not be as obvious. Oh, well, it still is. Okay, forget what I said. But yeah, that's the LODs kicking in. There's not a lot we can do about that. Not a lot we can do about that. Yeah. Thank you for watching as always, and see you in the next one.